as we round out our series, I want to remind us that the book of Ecclesiastes, it challenges us to live our lives backwards. For the last 3 months now, we've been talking about how do we live life with eternity in mind on a regular basis. Am I too hot? Does it feel like it's overwhelming you? Sorry. Okay, just making sure. So, living life backwards, excuse me, in light of eternity. And there's that one verse that we've been going back to over and over and over again. It's the thesis statement of the teacher. Everything is meaningless, says the teacher, completely meaningless. And I think this is why most pastors and most churches avoid this entire book in itself. Because if you allow it to be, the book of Ecclesiastes can be very confusing, discouraging, almost feel hopeless, right? So what's the point of life? If this is the initial statement, like this is the opening thesis, none of us are going to spend a whole lot of time pursuing what comes next. But I think that's because until recently, we didn't understand the real term, meaningless, right? That term, hevel, vapor, breath, smoke, temporary, fleeting, hard to hold. We don't have that word in our language. And so we read something like, everything is meaningless, totally meaningless. And it's like, well, what's the point of me keep reading that? Why should I even try to understand? We've talked about the two primary burdens of mankind, that we're never satisfied and that we rarely find meaning. This is the entire 12 chapters. I believe the writer of Ecclesiastes is trying to address these two primary issues that we have as people. That no matter how much we have, we always want just a little bit more. No matter how much time or how much money or how much influence or how much power, the human kind of condition leans us towards never being satisfied. And very rarely do we find meaning. Remember the two perspectives, right? We've got a horizontal and a vertical, under the sun and under heaven, and how important that's been over and over throughout this 12-week series. And I would encourage you, be really careful as you go forward in your own personal reading of Ecclesiastes and Scripture itself. Context is so important, right? Context is crucial. Because what the writer of Ecclesiastes says in one section about life under the sun does not even fit with our understanding of what life with God is like. It feels antithesis to it. So be careful. Today we're going to be spending the time we have together in Ecclesiastes chapter 12 and going over the last chapter, the final words of the teacher. And I just want to take a moment and share something with you, because this last chapter, these last 14 verses, they play off of some of what I would say one of my greatest personal fears. I don't know if I've shared this with you before, and all morning long, like drinking my coffee and hanging out with Jesus and walking in here, I'm like, are you sure you want me to share this? Like, is this really where you want me to go? All of us, right, as humans, we understand that our lives, in some way, shape, or form, are plagued with these kind of regular fears, insecurities, doubts, worries that we have as humans. Oftentimes, they're planted in our minds or our hearts or our lives very early in our lives. Some of us, our fear is heights. Some of us, our fear is public speaking. Some of us have a fear of being left out, right? Some of us have a fear of being rejected. Some of us are afraid to spend a whole lot of time with a whole bunch of people, right? Like those fears, they begin to implant themselves in our lives pretty early on. And if we're not careful, those fears can begin to overshadow everything about our lives. They can determine the quality of our lives, the quality of our relationships, the things that we do or don't do, the choices that we make, the risks that we take or don't take, in many ways can be driven by these fears. And there's been hints of it throughout all of Ecclesiastes. There's been hints of this one particular fear that is actually, I would say, if not the most significant fear that I carry as a person, one of my most significant fears. But then when we get to Ecclesiastes chapter 12, the writer of Ecclesiastes takes this specific fear head on. And again, we've talked about a lot of different fears throughout the entire book, right? We've talked about the fear of not measuring up, or the fear of injustices, that someone's going to wrong us, right? We talk about the fear of someone having more than we have, or someone being better off than we are, right? But this last chapter, the writer of Ecclesiastes begins to talk about the process of getting old. And that, dear friends, is one of my greatest fears as a person. On the funny side, I used to tell people that I wanted to die before I turned 30. I did. There was a period of time in my life that I thought 30 was like going to be the end. Like I envisioned 30 as like the most miserable moment of my life. And we had some dear friends at my last church who decided on my 30th birthday to take a whole bunch of very large, very black balloons and put like about a 15-foot set of 30 in our front lawn, and then this big 6x8 sign that says, "Honk, Josh is 30. And we lived on this 40-mile-an-hour road, and all day long, people just honking like crazy. I could not figure out why. Funny, though, just before I turned 30, I had another motorcycle accident that many of you don't know about. And there was a period of time when people thought that I was like trying to make my own fears come true. They're like, I don't want to turn 30, so I'm going to die at 29. My wife can attest to you that was not my intent on that day. But I want to take a moment just to explain to you where I believe my fear of growing old comes from. And now that I'm 40-something, okay, so I'm 46, but now that I'm in my 40s, I've come to the other side of 30, and I've began to really ask myself, where does this come from? Where does this fear, where does this insecurity about growing old come from? And I realized sometime over the last 10 years, God's helped me to understand where this fear came from. And it actually comes from my family of origin. Some of you may know this, but my dad was 52 years old when he had me, and 57 when he had my brother. So if you're doing the math, by the time I graduated from high school, he was 70, right? I was a high school senior. He was 70 years old. He'd been retired at that point for like 4 years, right? And my dad, like many of us, my dad was larger than life to me growing up. He was a pretty domineering, huge person to begin with. In his prime, he had about 2 inches on me. He was probably 6'3", 6'4". His wedding band, when I was in high school, graduated high school, his wedding band would fit over my thumb easily and it would like be loose. That'll tell you how big of a man this guy was. He was a World War II vet that served in the South Pacific as a Marine. He lived through the Great Depression. He had seen some of the darkest times in our country's history. He lived with a consistently abusive and alcoholic father. And in my world, my dad was everything, especially growing up. And I had this kind of, I'll call it holy fear of my father, somewhat because of his physical stature, but also because of his personality. Had a quite fearful personality. In fact, I remember 17 years old, I was senior year in high school, and I was like, I'm finally going to beat my dad at arm wrestling. Remember, he's 69. He kicked my butt. I'm not small. I don't know if you know that, but I was a decent-sized dude. At 70 years old, my father was still arm wrestling me and beating me. And as a boy, as a man, as someone who's trying to figure out my place in the world, my dad had this like huge presence in my life. This super deep voice that resonated wherever he was. This whistle that like I could be a mile and a half away and I knew I was in trouble because my dad's whistle, right? Like I knew how to read that whistle. But what happened was, as time marched on, his body was not good to him. As time continued, by the time I graduated from high school, he had begun to lose his sight, actually. Glaucoma went undiagnosed and went down in his left eye. The sight of a pea is all he could see, like a straw. If you put a straw up to your eye, he could only see about the amount of a straw out of his one eye, and he lost about 30% of his other eye. He'd already lost a fair amount of his hearing because of the war. Sometimes that benefited me. But the older he got, the longer and harder it became for him to hear. And then his body began to kind of droop over a period of time. And this man that was once bigger than life, he lost about 4 inches, maybe 5, over his last 10 years or so. And this is what he used to say to me. And this is where I think my fear comes from. I'd ask him how he's doing, and we'd talk about our day. He'd say, "Son, don't get old. Son, don't get old. It's miserable getting old." I began to watch this massive man, this bigger than life, turn into something that I didn't know, didn't understand. And for about the last 15 years of his life, I began to just grieve the loss. And it was like this little griefs. Most of the time I lived more than 4 or 5 hours away from my dad, and so I'd come home and he'd have these like huge steps down. His body would kind of begin to reject him, and I just kind of watched him wither. And something inside of me, something pretty profound, pretty deep, began to just take hold. This fear of growing old. And as I look back now, I think there's 2 pieces. One, it was the impact that my dad's journey had on me, right? The loss of freedom, the loss of strength, the loss of sight, the loss of hearing, the loss of ability to taste. And so he'd put 5 gallons of salt on every meal, right? Like, I began to lose parts of my dad for a better part of a decade and a half. But what was my deeper fear? What played off even more so was the fear behind my own worth as I got old. If I couldn't be who I used to be in the people's life because I lost my sight, my hearing, my ability, my agility, would I still have worth? Would I still have value? Would people still care for me? These fears that we carry, they're real, they're deep. And here I am, 46 years old, and I'm still wrestling through my own fears of growing old. And the writer of Ecclesiastes in chapter 12, he talks about this process of remembering our Creator, especially in our youth, because old age is a reality for all of us. And who really likes the alternative anyway, right? What's the alternative to old age but to die young? And so this last chapter, we read this last message from our teacher with regards to the things in life that we cannot control, with regards to the things in life that we can't fully stop from happening. And this last one is what it means to remember our Creator as our days draw on. But even more so, I love what the teacher in Ecclesiastes does. He talks about what it means to remember our Creator in our youth. So we're going to spend this few moments in Ecclesiastes 12, and would you watch this morning for the message that the teacher is trying to impart to us in this last chapter? Because I think it kind of sums up all of the previous 12 chapters. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the days of trouble come and the years approach when you will say, I find no pleasure in them. before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars grow dark and the clouds return after the rain. When the keepers of the house tremble and the strong men stoop, when the grinders cease because they are few, and those looking through the windows grow dim. When the doors to the street are closed and the sound of grinding fades. When people rise up at the sound of birds, but all their songs grow faint. When people are afraid of heights and of dangers in the streets. When the almond tree blossoms and the grasshopper drags itself along and desire no longer is stirred. Then people go to their eternal home and mourners go about their streets. Remember him, says the writer of Ecclesiastes. Remember him before the silver cord is severed and the golden bowl is broken and the pitcher is shattered at the spring and the well broken and the wheel broken at the well. And the dust returns to the ground it came from. And the spirit returns to God who gave it. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Everything is meaningless. Not only was the teacher wise, but he also imparted knowledge to the people. He pondered and searched out and set in order many proverbs. The teacher searched to find just the right words, and what he wrote was upright and true. The words of the wise are like goads, their collected sayings like firmly embedded nails, given by one shepherd. Be warned, my son, of anything in addition to them. Of making many books there is no end, and much study wearies the body. Okay, so students, if you ever get mad at your parents about having to do your homework, this is where you want to go. Quote Ecclesiastes 12. Of making many books is no end, and much study wearies the body. Now all has been heard. These are the last two verses in this message from the writer of Ecclesiastes. Now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments. For this is the duty of all mankind. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. I have a question for you. If you could, what would you go back and tell your younger self? You had one opportunity to speak one moment into your younger life. What would you go back and tell yourself? Would it have something to do with the Yankees and when they win so you can make some money? Would it have something to do with how you treated your parents? Would it have something to do with a decision that you were going to face that you wished you did a different way? Would it have something to do with your relationship with God? Perhaps something about prayer. Or maybe a person that you would tell your younger self to avoid. Maybe even a type of person that you became that you would tell your younger self to avoid. What I see in this passage, Ecclesiastes chapter 12, I see the teacher at the end of his life, at the end of his journey, at the end of his searching, at the end of his wondering and wanderings, and he's speaking into the next generation to come. And here we are, probably 2,500 years later. We get the benefit of a much older, much wiser perspective in our younger selves. And I would encourage us to pay attention. And this is the message, I think, that the writer of Ecclesiastes has for us today. Living life backward means daily remembering our Creator. When it's all said and done, and we've wrestled through all these realities and insecurities and inequities of life, when we wrestle through the pursuits that we have and the goals and the dreams and the hopes, right? Like when it's all said and done, at the end of it all, what we're told by a much older, much wiser person is that we should remember our Creator. daily. Not just every now and then, not just sometimes, not just like when big storms hit, but to daily live in this remembering of our Creator. I want to just take some time to unpack Ecclesiastes chapter 12. Let me give you just a little bit of an idea of the structure. This is actually, if you look in your Bibles, you'll see that it's kind of indented. Most Bibles have these verses, a good portion of the verses kind of indented and phrased. Easy way for you to tell that that's a poem. And really what the author of Ecclesiastes, all those parts about the end of life and about the house and all those kinds of things, it's actually part of this one beautiful poem. And it's interesting to me that if you remember, the writer of Ecclesiastes started his whole thesis out with that poem in Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Remember? A time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and uproot, a time to kill and to heal. What the writer of Ecclesiastes does in this first poem, all the way back in Ecclesiastes 3, he's talking about the rhythms of life. He's talking about the things that God has set in order that we can do very little about. But we call them the rhythms of life. And it's interesting to me that he begins his work with the rhythms of life and he ends his work with the rhythms of death, with the reality of what is to come should God not call time on our lives. And we get to tarry on this earth to the point of old age. So this is what he's doing. He's kind of bookending this entire collection with this beautiful, powerful poem on the rhythms of life, and on the other end, this beautiful, powerful, insightful poem on the rhythms of death, of growing old. And there's some themes that you've seen, right? Did you pick up on the theme of creation? He talks about the Creator a couple different times. He talks about the sun and the moon and the stars and the clouds and the rain and dust and spirit. So let's do that for a little bit. Let's just go back and let's unpack what the writer of Ecclesiastes is trying to tell us about remembering our Creator. So there it is. That's that first word. Remember our Creator in the days of your youth, before the days of trouble come and when the years approach, when you will say, I find no pleasure in them. That was one of the hardest things for me to watch in my own father, is that the things he once loved, he could no longer do. The music he once could play, his hands got so gnarled with arthritis, he could no longer play. The songs he loved to sing, his voice would no longer carry that tune. The drives he would love to take, he couldn't do anymore because his eyes wouldn't let him. So the writer of Ecclesiastes is being very clear here. Like, remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the days of trouble come and the years approach, when you will say, I find no pleasure in them. Right? What he's saying is, enjoy what God's given you while you can. But remember, it all comes from the Creator, that he is the source and the sustainer of our lives. Before the sun and light, okay, so here we go. We're starting to talk more about creation. Before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars grow dark and the clouds return after the rain. What does that sound like? It echoes of those first 6 days of creation, right? That the Spirit was hovering over the waters and it was dark and God spoke and there was light and God spoke and the earth separated from the water, right? Like, He's talking about echoes of creation, but that remind us of the reality that one day God's going to call time. Before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars grow dark and the clouds after their rain, this is the reality. He's talking about the growing dark of our lives. At the end, we see it over and over 36 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. The writer refers to death or dying. And here it is once more. This light that we see, the sun and the moon and the stars, the clouds and the rain, eventually they'll keep going and ours will stop. We won't experience them anymore. Verse 3, when the keepers of the house tremble and the strong men stoop. Do you know what he's talking about with the keepers of the house? Hold up your hands. This is what he's talking about. With old age, the the point comes where your fingers start to get gnarled and you start to get shaky and you can't do the things that you once were able to do. He's talking, this is how you take care of your home, for those of you who own a home, right? Primary way you take care of your home is through your hands. But what do you do when the keepers of the house begin to tremble and the strong men begin to stoop, right? We know that's a reality. As our vision begins to fade, we're more concerned about falling over, and so we start looking down further. And as I said, it took my dad probably about 5 or 6 inches of his life was taken away towards the end. When the grinders cease, what do you think that is? The grinders, the teeth, right? We were talking about a couple thousand years ago, right, when they didn't have quite as good of dentistry, right? But they begin to fall out. There's nothing you can do with it. They stop working. And those looking through the windows grow dim. What are the windows? Yeah. He's talking about when our lives, when our bodies start to reject us. When our hands start to tremble and our bodies start to stoop and our teeth start to fall and our eyes, we don't see like we used to. And then he switches metaphors, okay? So he's still referring to life and the reality of old age. But he switches metaphors and he says, when the doors to the street are closed and the sound of the grinding fades, what do you think the doors to the street are? Ears. How do you hear the street? How do you know about the working of life with not through your ears? So you're going deaf, you're going blind, your teeth are falling out. Life is coming to an end. When people rise up at the sound of birds, but all their songs grow faint, right? We can't even hear the birds any longer because we've begun to lose. Sleep, my dad used to say that, like, sleep was never fulfilling sleep anymore as he got older. He'd sleep a lot, but it never seemed to recharge him. And so he'd still get up with the birds in the morning and need another nap about an hour later. This is the journey of growing old. Verse 5, when people are afraid of heights, of dangers in the streets, most theologians would argue that he's talking about afraid of falling, right? Most of the streets in that day, they weren't paved streets. We didn't have sidewalks, right? So there's all these holes and all these dangers, and people begin to be afraid of their own balance. Their own bodies don't stay up the way that they used to. When the almond trees blossoms, you know what that is? It's a reference to the white hair that eventually most of us succumb to. Some of us are better at keeping it away. When the almond tree blossoms and the grasshopper drags itself along, right? The grasshopper was considered the most nimble of creatures, right? With just this tiny little hop, it could go exponentially further than any human, right? But when the grasshopper drags itself along and desire no longer is stirred, then people go to their eternal home, and mourners go about their streets. Do you see what the writer of Ecclesiastes is calling us to do? To remember our Creator while we still can, while we can see the things that God's blessed us with, while we can still hear the things, while we can still taste that amazing food that our family gets to share together. Remember your Creator. Because life is not forever. Because youth only lasts for a while. And eventually we all go to our eternal home, and the mourners fill the streets where we once walked. Verse 6, remember him. There it is again. Remember him before the silver cord is severed and the golden bowl is broken. Anybody want to take a guess on what he's referring to? Most often, especially in some of the nicer homes and some of the nicer cities, they would actually hang golden bowls from either inside buildings or outside, and they would fill them with oil, and there'd be a silver string that was a silver cord that was attached to it, and they would light it on fire. It's a reference to fire itself, right? To light. And before the pitcher is shattered at the spring and the wheel broken at the well, what's he referring to? Water. Right? The two things that we need to survive, heat and water, right? Like light and water. He's referring to like the point at which eventually all our flames go out, and then the water begins. The vessel in which the water is once held is broken. It's gone. And then he says, and the dust returns to the ground from which it came. What does that sound like? Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. And why do we say that? Okay, I'm sure you know. Go ahead. Exactly. I didn't even have to pay my oldest kid to say that. Because it is from dust that God created man. Right? That it says he took the dust of the earth and he piled it all up. And then what did God do? He breathed his spirit. Do you see the creation metaphors that are just laced throughout Ecclesiastes chapter 12? This reminder of God as our creator, that our original source is dust. And even with all the amazing medical technologies in the world, our future source is dust. That the ground from which we came will be the ground to which we go. And therefore we must remember our Creator. And he says in verse 8, meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher, everything is meaningless. Okay, I'm going to take some liberties here, and I wrote my own version of this, but I'm not going to sell it or try to promote it. But here's what I think he's really saying. Vaporous vapor, says the teacher. Everything is vapor. Not that it's meaningless, but that it goes away so quickly. That the moment you think you've got it, it's gone. Vaporous vapor, says the teacher. Everything is vapor. All of this life that we live, all of the pursuits that we have, all of the food that we enjoy, and the relationships we create, and the things that we accomplish, and the jobs that we hold, and the houses that we build, eventually they will all be vapor. They're gone. And the dust returns to the ground and came. Okay, so let me stop here for 1 second. So he's saying vaporous vapor, right? He's talking about all these things that we think that we get to hold on to. Eventually, they're going to return to dust, and they're gone. But then there's something in the Hebrew I want you to see, okay? Because when you read verse 7, dust returns to the ground from which it came, and the Spirit returns to the God who gave it. It looks like we're returning like God just gave us the Spirit. But when you go back to the Hebrew and you see where this phrase lands, it actually lands after verse 8. Vaporous vapor, says the teacher. Everything is vapor. And it returns to the God who gave it. Not just the Spirit that God breathed into man, right? But everything that has ever been created, it will eventually return to the God who created it. That's the whole purpose of the story of Jesus, is to redeem and restore that which was lost and broken with sin, to bring it back to God, back to a relationship with God. This God who gave it will one day call time. Some of you who are observers, you probably noticed that I almost never wear a watch. But today I'm wearing a watch. And I want to tell you why. This watch I wear, my dad gave me not long before he passed away. And he came from an era where you always wore a watch. Like you always wore a watch. It was pre-cell phone days. Like if you had any money at all, you had some way to tell the time. For years, he always had a watch, and he always got frustrated that I didn't. So he'd buy me watches hoping that I'd actually wear them. Sometimes I did, sometimes I didn't. But today I wear this as a reminder that someday God's going to call time on our lives. That the relationships we have, that the people that he's given us, the breath that we breathe, the decisions that we make, the lives that we build, that God will one day call time. Because it's his to begin with. It came from him and will return to him one day. The most vaporous of vapors, says the writer of Ecclesiastes. The the heaviest of the heaviest, the smoke of the smokiest, right? That God owns it all, created it all, and one day it will return to him. So, how? The beautiful poem, hauntingly accurate about what happens to our bodies as we grow old, right? Just incredible use of words to remind us of the shortness of our lives. But let me ask us, how? How do we do this? How do we daily remember our Creator in the midst of the craziness and chaos of life and the 40-plus hour work weeks and the kids that always need something, or the parents that are aging and we have to take care of them, or the taxes that got to get paid, or the house that's got to get fixed? How? How do we remember our Creator daily? I see 4 ideas in the last 5 verses for how to remember our Creator. First one, the writer of Ecclesiastes challenges us to daily remember our Creator in our pleasure, right? In the good things. Let's go back and look at verse 9. Not only was the teacher wise, but he also imparted knowledge to the people. He pondered and searched and set out in order to find many proverbs. The teacher searched to find just the right words, he says. And what he wrote was upright and true. In another language, one of the other versions of the Bible, it says, he searched for the most delightful truths. The truths that would bring the most joy to our lives. And I think what the writer of Ecclesiastes is referring to is creation itself, right? Genesis 1:31. God saw all that he had made and said it was awful. It's miserable, worthless, wretched. 8 times from Genesis 1 through Genesis 31, 1 to 31, God said it was good. Every time God finished a day, he said it was good, it was good, it was good, it was good. You see, God designed us for those good things, for the pleasures that he gave us, right? Remember the gift that he gave to Adam and Eve, right? Be fruitful and multiply, subdue the world, right? Enjoy everything that I've created except this one thing. God designed mankind for pleasure in him. God designed mankind for joy in him, for hope in him. So when you get that really nice steak from your friend that raised their cow on their farm and they bless you with it, enjoy it. But remember, it's all God's. It's all his. Even in our pleasures, remember that it came from the Creator and that we are but dust, and to dust we will go. I think for a long time in my own Christian journey, my own walk with Christ, I got the impression that in order to follow God, you had to be miserable. I did. I felt like my life was just full of all the things I couldn't do. And God was just waiting for me to have a good time so he could zap me, right? Like that's how I saw my relationship with God. But what the writer of Ecclesiastes is calling us to do, he's calling us to remember our God and our pleasure and the good things that God gives us. God was the creator of joy. God was the creator of pleasure. God was the creator of all the living things that walked on the earth and all the fruits and vegetables and all these amazing things that Adam and Eve got to eat. God created them for us, right? For our good. And he called them good. But what happens, right? What happens when we forget our Creator in the midst of our pleasure? When we forget where it came from, we get Hosea chapter 13. This is God's words to Israel. He says, I cared for you in the wilderness and the land of burning heat. When I fed them, they were satisfied. And when they were satisfied, they became proud. And then they, let's say it together, forgot me. I think one of the greatest enemies in our Christian life is when we get the good things we think we want and then we forget to thank the Creator for them. I don't know about you, but I grow the least when everything's going well in my life. When the fruit is on the vine, when the grass doesn't have weeds, when I pay off the car payment, when I'm loving my job and my wife thinks I'm amazing and my kids don't hate me, right? Like, I don't need God. At least I act that way. This is the danger of pursuing pleasure in our lives. Not that God didn't intend it for us to enjoy it, but that he didn't intend it for us to enjoy it so much that we forgot the giver of the gift. And this is what Israel does over and over and over. And dear friends, do you understand how much we're like Israel? All the way through the judges period, into the kings period, into the exile period. Israel would cry out to God, God, please take all this pain away, make it all go away, take away all my enemies, and take away all my hunger and all those kinds of things. God would do it, and then they'd thank God for about a year, and then for the next 40 years they forget God. I believe that that's just God's way of reminding us that he is both the gift and the giver, and that we are to enjoy God daily in our pleasure. This morning I woke up and Sue's made this amazing cup of coffee. I won't tell you who it's by because it's not a commercial, but it's one of the best cups of coffee I've had in a while. And I just sat there this morning. I was like, man, God, thanks for making coffee. How good is this cup of coffee right now? I think that's just in a small microcosm what it means to remember God daily in our pleasure. When we find something good, when we experience something good, when there's an amazing song, when a picture comes into our minds, when we see this vista, when we have a good cup of coffee, right? It's just thanks God. You made the beans that the roasters picked, that my wife chose. You made the water that made it and to actually taste good. You gave me this cup that some artisan decided that they were going to create, one of my favorite mugs. I do this every Sunday. You might not know this about me, but I've got a favorite mug, and I've got a favorite place to sit, and I've got the need for the brown holy water. And it's a very spiritual moment for me, but it doesn't really have anything to do with Scripture. It's just me being in the presence of God and thanking him for the goodness that is him. Lest we become satisfied and proud and forget our God. Remember him in our pleasure, and then the writer of Ecclesiastes says, remember him in our pain. That's an easier one for us, right? Can we agree? Verse 11, the words of the wise are like goads. You know what that is? It's a stick with nails on the end that they use to move sheep along. That's what a goad is. They put some nails on the end of a stick and they hit. Remember, sheep have the pretty thick wool and pretty thick heads, right? And so they need some adjustments at times. Guess what? You're a sheep too. And what God is saying, sorry, I'm a sheep. But what the writer of Ecclesiastes is saying, that God will put this pain into our lives to move us, to direct us. They're collected sayings like firmly embedded nails given by one shepherd, right? That's what it's saying. God uses the pain in our lives to remind us that he is creator, sustainer of the universe. Genesis 3:16 talks about it this way, right? Remember, okay, so stop. Don't look at that one. Can I ask you a question? Where did pain come from? Honestly, where did pain come from? My interpretation is that God, when he created the earth and he created it perfectly, pain was never supposed to be part of it. Pain is a result of sin and the curse. And here it is, Genesis 3:16, right? This is after Adam and Eve broke the one rule, decided to eat the one plant that they weren't supposed to eat, right? They brought all of mankind into this place of sin and brokenness by their one decision. This is what God says, I will make your pains in childbearing very severe. He's talking to the woman. He's talking to Eve. He's saying it wasn't going to have to hurt to have babies, but now it's going to hurt. With painful labor you will give birth to your children, your desires. Pain did not exist until this moment. Pain wasn't even thought of. You couldn't stub your toe. You couldn't cut your hand off. Right? The pain did not exist until this moment, according to Scripture. And then verse 17, I'm being a little facetious. Maybe you could stub your toe and cut your hand off. I don't know that for sure. But pain was not a part of the human condition. God said to Adam, he said, because you listened to your wife and ate from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat from it. Cursed is the ground because of you through pain. Through painful toil, you will eat food from all of it, all the days of your life. Isn't it just like the enemy of our souls to make me think for most of my life that the most painful thing I could do is follow God, when really the most painful thing I could do is to not follow God? Pain is a direct result of sin and the brokenness of mankind, but it's designed by God for us to remember him. Like the goads on the end of the stick for the sheep, it's designed for us to daily remember him. So if you wake up in pain and you've got something that just doesn't seem to want to work right, or that part of your body you wish did what it used to do, a chance for you to cry out for God. Daily remembering our Creator in our pleasure and our pain, and then in our perspectives, right? Verse 13 says it this way, now all has been heard. Here's the conclusion to the matter. Fear God, keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of mankind. This is all God asks of us, to love him, fear him, and keep his commandments. But yet, we kind of take God's commandments and we think of them as suggestions. We take God's rules and God's ways, and then we think, he won't notice if I do it this way. This is the question that Satan threw at Adam and Eve. Did God really say that? Did God really mean you couldn't eat that one? You see, our perspectives begin to get skewed when we forget our Creator and wonder, like, is it really that bad? Is it really going to hurt anybody? Ecclesiastes 5:2 says, do not be quick with your mouth, do not be hasty in your heart to utter anything before God, for God is in heaven and you are on earth, so let your words be few. The writer of Ecclesiastes is trying to reset our perspective by calling us to remember our Creator. By calling us to remember the source of all life. Because God is in heaven, and here we are on earth, and from dust we have come, and to dust we will go. Isaiah 55:8-9, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. God, as Creator, will reset our perspectives if we allow it to. It will challenge us to trust God, to believe that he's bigger, to believe that he's got greater plans for us than we could ever have for ourselves. I love the way Jacques Ellul says it. He says, our problems do not stem from our failure to stay in our garden, right? Adam and Eve didn't have problems before they broke God's laws. All the devils of this world stem from us taking ourselves to be the Creator. Adam and Eve brought upon themselves in that one decision pain and brokenness, sin and separation and fear and anxiety and worry, heartbreak like the world has never known until that moment. All because they decided to set themselves up as Creator. To remember God daily is to remember him in our perspectives. What he says is right is right. And what he says is wrong is wrong. And we don't argue with the God of the universe. Finally, daily remembering our Creator in our pleasure, our pain, our perspectives, and in our planning. Verse 14. Excuse me. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil, right? Like, so whatever we decide with our lives, wherever the direction we think our lives should go, as we make our plans, as we pursue our dreams, as we enjoy our blessings, as we develop our relationships, remember God is Creator. Proverbs 69 puts it this way, in their hearts, humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps. This reminder from Ecclesiastes, no matter how old or how young you are, that God is the one who determines the plans for our future. Luke 12, Jesus puts it this way. Jesus said to him, "Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." I so love and so get frustrated by that one statement. It's so true, but it's so easy to forget when we forget our Creator. That life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. And he told them this parable, right? So in order to get his disciples to understand how important it is to invite God into our planning, he says, "The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, 'What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops.' And then he said, 'This is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And there I'll store my surplus of grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry.'" What's that sound like? Ecclesiastes, under the sun. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we may die, right? If there is no God, then this makes absolute sense. If Jesus is not real, then do all these things. Don't come to church anymore. I mean it. If there is no God, if Jesus isn't real, if there's no resurrection after the dead, there's no purpose. Eat, drink, be merry. And that, if that's working for you, then God bless you. But it's never worked for me. Jesus is saying, like, when we forget our Creator, we start building our barns, we start planning our future, we start establishing our ways, and then all of a sudden, God calls time. But God said to him, verse 20, this is Jesus' own words, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God." When we forget to invite God into our planning, we do so at our own peril. We live as fools because our life is not our own. Because from dust we have come, and to dust we will return. Because remembering God, living life backwards means remembering our Creator. Living life backward means daily, perspective by perspective, plan by plan, pain by pain, pleasure by pleasure, inviting God into our everyday moments. This is what it means. As we close out Ecclesiastes, this is what it means to remember our Creator and our pleasure, our pain, our perspectives, and our planning. A.W. Tozer says it this way: "When I understand that everything happening to me is to make me more like Christ, it resolves a great deal of anxiety." I love that line. Whether we think it's good or whether we think it's bad, whether we want it to happen or whether we don't, whether we're young or whether we're old, whether the sun shines or the rain falls, everything that happens to us is to make us more like Christ. And believing that, trusting that, inviting our Creator into that reduces so much of our anxiety. So how do we do? How did we do it? How did the writer of Ecclesiastes do it, addressing these two primary burdens, right? That we're never satisfied and that we rarely find meaning. My hope for you and my hope for me is that this series will change the way we live. Otherwise, it was a great 3 months. But if it doesn't change the way that we live, if we don't daily invite the Creator into our perspectives, our planning, our pain, and our pleasure, it's probably worthless. Living life backward means daily remembering our Creator. And Jesus said it this way: "Is there anything worth more than your soul?" Living with eternity in mind. Would you pray with me? Jesus, I just feel like this is an important season for me as a person and for us as a church. Coming out of this journey through Ecclesiastes, coming to the end, there's a heaviness, there's a grief to it, but then there's some excitement to it. My prayer, God, is that you would teach us to live with eternity in mind. Every day of our lives. To live with an eternal perspective. To invite you into our pain and our pleasure, our perspectives and our planning. God, would you be first in our hearts and our lives and in our church, we pray. Amen.